As many different combat occurrences were unfolding, being carried out by the 58th Group Army of the PLA, the local Trojan force assigned this particular AO, or Area of Operations. The Will Rogers International Airport was by 4:15 only 15 minutes away from being captured by the Air Defense Artillery troops of the Air Defense Battalion, the Short Range Air Defense Battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA's 58th Group Army, as well as military police from the Military Police Company from the Headquarters Battalion over the entire 17th Combined Arms Brigade. As the area was being rolled up by these forces, clearing the terminal buildings after cruise missile strikes had destroyed large groupings of American troops from the 2nd Battalion 290th Infantry Regiment, itself a training-oriented battalion mobilized from the reserves for protecting the city's critical infrastructure, including the airport, along with alphabet paramilitary troops of the Americans. These forces, supported by a fresh volley of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions, were rapidly overtaking this area and this airport facility. With downtown, the high-value capture operations having had completely finished by 4:15 a.m. as the Special Operations troops had thoroughly and methodically cleared large sections within the city that encompassed the areas within which their forces, backed up by mechanized infantry, at least in the local capture operation in the west part of the downtown area, they had hurriedly conducted these operations and completed them, wrapping them up again by 4:15 a.m. before they began to fan out to carry out other operations, such as forming portions of the cordon forces, not just around the western pocket that was developing around American troops, or what remained of them, from the 1st of the 160th and Artillery Battalion within the 45th Infantry Brigade combat team, but against a grouping of local alphabet paramilitary forces and even some armed civilians in the western pocket, numbering over 200. And in the eastern pocket, they formed the western perimeter around that pocket, as 2 companies had been flown in to conduct that high-value capture operation against state officials and also against the state military leadership over the entire Air and Army National Guard of the Oklahoma State Guard forces. With these operations having had successfully concluded and coming to an end as it related to the airport capture minutes away, another operation was now unfolding. After the kill box had been successful, highly so, against the 1st Battalion of the 279th Infantry Regiment, a mechanized infantry battalion from within the 45th Infantry Brigade combat team, along with a grouping of armed civilians, having been aware of previous reporting prior to the invasion that these military forces would be present there. After the attack, helos had eliminated other armed civilian pockets with the same battalions, one mechanized infantry from the 93rd and one from the 53rd, moving in, surrounding and destroying an ad hoc refugee center attempting to be established before it really even got off the ground in the first few hours, had moved on, surrounded and destroyed a grouping of these armed civilians, having been gored by artillery fire, forcing the remainder of them into this kill box with the 1st of the 279th. Now we're converging from the south after having taken 45 minutes to top off their logistics and move into this area before the mechanized infantry battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade would peel off to surround and destroy the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the entire 45th Infantry Brigade combat team itself comprised of essentially the command and administrative elements, which had set itself up in an empty parking lot that was requisitioned for use by the state regime for its guard forces to establish their campsite on the periphery of this parking lot, where they used their vehicles or they used this lot for their vehicles as their temporary motor pool location and had tents set up on the periphery of it. Essentially, early on, at 2 a.m., when the first salvos of YJ-18C and caliber cruise missiles from the Club K container-based disguise systems and the YJ-18Cs from those Chinese equivalent systems had begun to fire their first salvos, 4 missiles from one container had impacted the parking area, destroying the vehicles of the HHC, leaving the rest essentially completely footbound and more or less trapped in the area. The tents, for now, were essentially spared, as those in particular had not been targeted by the cruise missiles beginning to fire at 2 a.m., as the vehicles were top priority for one, and for two, it was anticipated that the leadership could maybe be captured alive as the 2 different battalions moved rapidly northwards, as again, it was only 4:15 a.m. when they began to arrive in this area, very, very early into the first day of the invasion, as it was literally only 3 hours and 45 minutes into the actual entire Oklahoma City battle from the moment contact began at 12:30 a.m., or 30 minutes after the official beginning of the invasion, and technically the technical starting time of the battle at Oklahoma City with the anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as the booting on of the electronic warfare battalion of the 58th Signals and EW regiments, vital equipment in that regard, jamming redundant communications that were not connected to satellite or to anything hackable through the internet. These forces were being converged upon by the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade's Mechanized Infantry Battalion, tasked with surrounding and destroying what remained of the HHC, or possibly capturing its leadership if possible, with the other battalion that belonged to the 93rd, the other Mechanized Infantry Battalion, now having its Armored Battalion thrown into the battle for the first time after this kill box had concluded, as the armor would be a substitute for the aviation assets of the Armed Recon Helo Company and Attack Helo Company, now flying combat aviation patrols to the east of the city in preparation for the entire PLA 58th Group Army to be relieved and replaced by an external group army of the external component moving north rapidly, set to arrive the following day at some point, as the 10th PLA Group Army that had conducted the battle at Laredo was supposed to essentially relieve and replace the 58th to allow for it to move to the direct northeast and capture Tulsa. Before then, Tulsa's international airport had already been hit by tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and combat aircraft of the Russians, who sent a MiG-35 squadron, their only MiG-35 squadron, as well as an Su-27 squadron and an Su-34 squadron to hit that particular international airport, as it was the home of the Air National Guard's 125th Fighter Squadron, the squadron tasked with the air defense of the Oklahoma area with its F-16s. That was already destroyed within the opening minutes of the entire invasion, as the tactical ballistic missiles had been the first to strike, and the airstrikes were just a redundant follow-up operation as the aircraft arrived in the area over an hour and a half into the entire invasion, having flown from their bases in Mexico. Same as the Chinese aircraft arriving into this battle had been the case. With one pair of J-11s remaining in this part of the city to fly combat air patrols, they would be tasked with aiding the battle occurring against the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, itself having a namesake after combat engineers within it, including Bravo Company and Charlie Company, comprised of its signals intelligence company, with also its headquarters company and its alpha company being its combat engineer assets. Now, as the mechanized infantry was moving in around, the artillery fire was becoming quite heavy into the area, pounding a civilian suburban neighborhood as they began to cluster together after having begun to emerge from their homes to try to ascertain what to do about what was going on in the first place, as the Armored Bttn was now approaching parallel to State Highway 62, moving on to assist in the surrounding of and destruction of these forces, with them to take one half of the perimeter and assault it, with the mechanized infantry to take the other half and also assist in the assault against these forces, with heavy artillery support from the 40 PLZ-05 155mm howitzers of the artillery battalion belonging to the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, having, after successfully utilized these heavy resources in terms of their artillery fire to support the operations just to the south of this area against the armed reactionary civilian cluster that was attempting to set up and protect an ad hoc refugee camp in the local area, as well as the kill box, they now could shift all their fire into this particular area against the combat engineer force, the Brigade Engineering Battalion and special troops of it, and against the armed reactionary civilians moving in a similar manner to these who moved in to the kill box that had been established around the other water sewage treatment plant, this one being yet another. As the Combat Engineer / Special Troops Battalion, the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, had opted to stay and hold fast to their orders, as there were no communications, although they knew full well that all hell was breaking loose, these forces were now about to have the full crushing weight of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade fall upon them as they moved into the area, as well as the artillery fire and the air support from the pair of J-11 fighters now being utilized in a ground strafing role against armed reactionary civilians and vehicles belonging to the Bravo Company, or the military intelligence company of the 545th. As we go to the map, the Mechanized Infantry Battalion committed one of its 6 different mechanized infantry companies, leaving its fire support company of the battalion off the map to fire its multiple launch 130mm light artillery rockets, as well as the platoon of PLL-05 heavy assault gun mortars, which were a dual-use weapon, which could be used in direct fire or mortars, or as heavy mortars, as these were 120mm shells, which were very powerful as well. They had a 5.5 mile range, while the rockets had a 5 mile range, and they were being fired over this battlefield and against armed civilians moving into this particular area, in conjunction with the 155mm heavy artillery shells coming from the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers. As the different Combined Arms Brigades artillery battalions were either armed with the PLZ-05, such as the artillery battalions of the 93rd, the 53rd, and 28th Heavy Combined Arms Brigades, the 53rd and 93rd being medium Combined Arms Brigades, while the other Combined Arms Brigades, the 190th, 118th, and the 17th, utilized the Type 83 152mm self-propelled howitzers. As these forces moved in, 2 tank companies had been committed into this battle with their very powerful and advanced Type-96B main battle tanks, which were only a degree of separation was between them and the Type 99A, between the Type 96B and 99A, as the Type 99A was even more advanced than these tanks, as it had a few features that the 96B didn't have, such as the trophy equivalent system that the Chinese had, which was enough to defeat incoming ATGMs, as it would blast them out of the air before they even impacted the tank, completely negating their effectiveness before they even had an opportunity to hit. However, the Type-96B, although it incorporated many of the same technologies of the 99A, minus a few, and also had extremely strong armor, including a layer of explosive reactionary armor, or a pleak armor, as it could be armed with either or, the NERA being the applique armor and the ERA being the explosive reaction armor. They did have a degree of protection against incoming tank shells and some ATGM systems, but one of their tanks would end up being destroyed by 2 javelins being fired at the lead tank, destroying it, being fired by the combat engineer dismounts who actually had access to a tiny stock of these weapons, along with AT-4s, which were less destructive against tanks and very potent infantry fighting vehicles like the cutting edge VN-20, which was brand new, state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry, boasting its 100mm cannon, 30mm autocannon literally connected to it, and its 7.62 by 54mm turret-based coaxial machine gun, as the Type-96Bs themselves were equipped with very potent weapons like the 125mm main gun that could even fire ATGMs itself, its coax machine gun, and its turret-mounted 12.7mm heavy machine gun. These would contribute decisively as well. And the anti-tank company that was also a part of the Armored Bttn, which itself had 4 companies of these Type-96B main battle tanks, the anti-tank company consisting of the AFT-10 anti-tank vehicles that could each carry 8 apiece of the extremely potent HJ-10 long-range anti-tank missiles, and all the fire would be ISR directed, as always, as well as the integrated AI system processing real-time battlefield data collected from the ISR capabilities and many other dimensions of the modern evolving battlefield, the fluid battlefield, and putting that information out to each and every last force on the battlefield, especially through the combat data links, which fed a literal by-the-second update on the modern fluid evolving battlefield to each and every vehicle and each and every squad leader that carried a tiny, portable, wrist-worn combat data link that served both as a transponder, like those in the vehicles, to show where the positioning of the troops roughly was based on the positioning of their leaders of each squad, as well as those in the vehicles, making for extremely accurate, destructive firepower that was also safe and avoided friendly fire, with friendly fire incidents cut down to almost 0 throughout this entire invasion. The Americans, for their part, by now lacking complete ISR capabilities due to their satellites having been destroyed in the opening minutes, with their military satellites knocked down on the first salvo of Dongning 2s, 3s, and S-500s, among other anti-satellite weapons, they now could only fire at what they could see, whereas the Chinese had layers of ISR capabilities ranging from the most local of layers at the quadcopter, squad, and platoon, and even at the company level, to the higher macro layers carried out by spy planes or recon drones such as WZ-8 high-altitude stealth recon drones, WZ-7 high-altitude regular recon drones, CH-3s, CH-4s, and others, which went all the way up even higher to satellite-based ISR capabilities, all layered together to provide the most up-to-date real-time battlefield updates and data for the troops in the field to fire their weaponry with a degree of precision and destructiveness that was unparalleled at any other time in history. A fresh volley of CH-901As was fired to support the troops of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, its Mechanized Infantry Battalion, and Armored Bttn, moving into the area, as well as the troops of the other Combined Arms Brigade, the 53rd, that committed one of its mechanized infantry battalions operating to the direct west of this particular battlefield, surrounding the company of the headquarters company over the whole entire brigade of the 45th Infantry Brigade combat team, which was relatively encamped somewhat close to this area. Charlie was the first to be hit, as they had very sensitive equipment in the form of their signals intelligence equipment, and was hit more out of SOP than a real need to hit them first, as again, it would be SOP to destroy sensitive equipment and as quickly as possible. And although the Americans really couldn't utilize this equipment to any real advantage, they and their troops were hit first, as the troops had been staying in a series of hotel buildings, as well as there being a restaurant on this corner that was destroyed inadvertently because the hotels are being targeted by shells landing between them. They also gutted this motel office and these two motel buildings that were across the street from the hotels as the shells landed right in this area right here. Their vehicles had been parked of Charlie Company of the Signals Co. over across the street from this city block that had hotels on it, next to a grocery store, which its parking lot here. Charlie's vehicles having been destroyed along with the gas station and its surrounding parking lot at the very opening of this map. As some of the first things occurring on this map are the inbound CH-901As flying into this area, with the pair of J-11s coming in and strafing with their 30mm nose cannons at these armed reactionary civilians moving into the area to try to team up with the military personnel who they perceived as having heavier and better equipment than they did, which they did, but it wouldn't make much of a difference, and also against the vehicles of the incoming elements of Bravo Company, or the military intelligence company, which had been equipped with gun trucks, being their Max Pro MRAPs with their crew serve weapons on top. The headquarters company over the entire 545th was mostly deployed in and around the outside of this water sewage treatment plant right here. This being its main building, although they had two of their vehicles, they had two of their LMTV trucks in the parking lot for the employees of this area, of this building, and they had their platoons scattered amid these buildings, and part of them being outside in the form of there being two squads from this platoon, whereas this was a full platoon and this was a full platoon, in the main office admin building, as well as the pump control building, as well as also in this backup pump building right here, the chemical building, and none, though, were deployed in this area, as they early on had gone outside to protect the perimeter from the hilltop from the emerging tank platoons of this tank company, two platoons on either side of the street, rolling up in a double column tank formation into the area, while this tank company was rolling under these highway overpasses of Highway 62, which was an elevated highway in this area, as exit ramp, on ramp. As these forces were moving up and into the area, they were beginning to lob their tank shells, as well as HJ-10 anti-tank missiles being fired from their anti-tank company, which was further afield and off-map, as they had great range to their systems. And although the American combat engineers of the combat engineer platoons comprising the combat engineer company, this being its headquarters platoon, had Bradleys, as they had converted over years ago from M113 APCs to Bradleys to give them a better degree of self-defense for their troops that would be conducting engineering operations in the form of what combat engineers would typically do. This enhanced their firepower greatly by giving them vehicles that had tow missiles on them and a 20mm autocannon, among others. And as these forces had moved into the area after the first shells had already completely annihilated much of Charlie Company, driving the surviving squads of the company from different platoons that had not been present in the hotels when they had been struck, as they had been outdoors, and pulling guard over on their vehicles across the street. They had run and into this area the moment the first shells struck, narrowly dodging incoming shells that blasted this gas station to oblivion and all of their sensitive vehicles and equipment of their company pertaining to signals intelligence, with the vehicles of the headquarters company being destroyed at the very opening of this map up here, just next to the facility directly to the north in this empty lot. As empty lots had separated this grocery store and parking lot for it, the water treatment facility, sewage treatment facility, and this gas station from a suburban neighborhood from which these armed civilians had come out of their homes by this point. They were spotted by ISR assets as they tried to decide on what to do before running across approximately close to a kilometer of open fields before reaching the water treatment facility, with only some making it into the buildings alive by the time imminent artillery strikes came in, not just to hit them, but because they wanted to hit them at the same time these gun trucks from Bravo Company that were camped out further to the north in these lots, one platoon, two platoons, and elements of another platoon, with the rest being destroyed up to the north, with its headquarters platoon being destroyed and two of their vehicles being destroyed, as tank shells flew in as the lead tanks of these companies, of this company here with its lead two platoons of 5 tanks each, firing shells, as well as there being loitering munitions equipped with HE warheads, crashing into and destroying these MRAPs, these Max Pro MRAPs, while artillery came in and decimated these platoons of the gun trucks that were equipping the military intelligence company's platoons, this platoon being decimated by artillery strikes from 155mm howitzer shells, as well as this platoon being completely destroyed and part of this one destroyed with its headquarters platoon elements. As this arrow is encapsulated in red, these armed American reactionary civilians were decimated as well, needless to say, as the artillery strikes had come in, along with the strafing attacks from these 30mm nose cannons of the J-11 fighter jets that had been called in to assist in this endeavor. As the loitering munitions came in, not only would they impact the vehicles and some of the forces consisting of the military intelligence over here, such as so, but also they would decimate elements of the headquarters troops that emerged from the building and took up position in this wooded hill, a hill which part of the facility was actually built into, with a hallway going underneath this hill right here into the ground from the main building, with a stairwell connecting this building on the upper level to the lower laying main building. And this was a pump building right here, controlled by the different pumping stations, as well as this one being a building where water was drawn in and basically piped into this pool right here that was pumped into the sediment treatment pools and chemical treating pools with chemicals able to be pumped in and controlled from this main building and this chemical building and the backup pump building to treat the water in the sediment pools. And essentially it could be pumped back out of there into this building, which was pumped back in to the drinking water, the local drinking water. As they were in here, and this building was generally off limits to heavy weapon strikes itself, precision artillery strikes called in by ISR landed here and decimated these troops, along with tank shells being fired by 2 tank platoons moving into this particular area, pausing here to fire their tank shells before moving and setting up position here with their lead platoon, while the other platoon stayed staggered in this street. At the same exact time as combat in this area was breaking out in full force, the mechanized infantry combat platoons of the Mech Infantry Company moving into this area, with the other companies belonging to the Mechanized Infantry Battalion assisting in the surrounding and cordoning of this particular 1 mile by 1 kilometer area in terms of its total size, in terms of scale. This company was committed directly to the battle, along with this tank company, and the anti-tank company, with the armored infantry companies, 2 of which belonging to the tank company, helping the other 2 tank companies to surround their portion of the cordon, while to link up with the mechanized infantry companies tasked with their portion of surrounding the cordon, moving up from beneath the State Highway 62 highway overpasses, moving under them to surround the area, which is where this company peeled off and is coming into this map from. As the ISR assets directed everything with AI support and processing the information, this platoon could see where all the activity was of these forces, including dismounted squads that had run into these rubble piles. This rubble pile that was a former restaurant and this rubble pile that was formerly a hotel was occupied by a squad apiece, while this platoon that was currently in a security formation, as the first shells had blown Charlie completely to oblivion, minus roughly a platoon-sized grouping of its troops that sought shelter in this apartment, they had begun to move around, with this squad breaking into 2 half squads, getting into this Bradley and into this Bradley, with this full squad getting into the M1150 armored engineering vehicle itself, being a sturdy vehicle that had a Panther mine roller attached to it at the time, which didn't really help things much in this situation, but it was just part of their equipment, and it was attached to it before this battle it even broke out, even before the invasion broke out, and it was never removed, which would make movements a little bit more complicated into this particular area, as rubble spilled into the streets from this former building, and this building was being captured at the time where they began to move in force, with this Bradley having its squad remount up into it as the engineers mounted up into this vehicle, and the half squad went into this Bradley and the other half went into this Bradley at the opening of the fighting. With this full squad that was originally part of this Bradley, belonged to this Bradley, bounding across the street, while the half squad that went into this, it was actually paired to this Bradley with a half squad getting in, was moving into this area to get out of the line of fire, as by now they were fully aware that HJ-10 missiles had flown into the area and right away, right off the bat, decimated this Bradley right here on this corner, as this apartment building temporarily blocked these vehicles from the HJ-10s, as it was a 5-floor building, but they could hit this vehicle right here. And the armored engineering vehicle began to slowly move out of the area, while these other vehicles were now moving into position here. While that was going on, literally at the same exact timing, this Type 89A armor personnel carrier was laying down heavy machine gun fire on this building, as there were troops in the building firing back out, but it made it increasingly difficult as heavy machine gun rounds were shredding into this building on its upper floors and even on its bottom floor, as troops in these 2 squads hugged these apartment buildings on this side of the street, this being a street here, street here, street here, a more wide boulevard here. While these troops hugged these 2 buildings and returned fire, they prepared to bound and cover tactically, this squad making a short bound into the street, laying down fire, while this squad, as they laid suppressive fire along with the vehicle-based fire, bolted into this building to begin to clear it, where fire at this squad began to subside, as now they were fully aware, after seeing this squad get across the street and into the building, they were fully aware they were going to have to defend the building from the inside, as this squad was now moving methodically through, with this squad bounding across, taking a few shots, but breaking in. This squad losing 1 soldier, a KIA, this squad a WIA, and this squad would lose a KIA as well, and as would this squad. So there would be 3 KIAs among the squads and several WIAs among these squads, as the fighting in this particular area was intense. So although they had total ISR dominance and heavy fire support, the Americans did get in a few good licks, although not good enough, as time would tell, as these Bradleys didn't even have a chance to fire their tow systems at the lead tank, as the tank had fired shells first upon coming from beneath the overpass, as the tanks in the back didn't necessarily want to fire first, as they could damage the highway infrastructure, and that was an absolute no-go. So these tanks, upon getting through or in a safe area where they could fire their shells without risking the infrastructure, although they had excellent ballistic computers and fire control systems and ISR assets of theirs to guide their fire, they still wanted to be cautious in so doing. And again, these combat engineers had a very tiny supply of Javelin anti-tank missiles, with most of the rest of their anti-tank systems being AT-4s, which really could do nothing whatsoever at all to the tanks, or even really to the infantry fighting vehicles, which consisted of the VN-20s, which were state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry, as this one moving through rubble-choked street is depicting a VN-20, 100mm main gun, 30mm autocannon, and 7.62 by 54mm machine gun on the turret here, with its ISR assets scanning the area all around the vehicle. Incoming CH-901A loitering munition about to impact a target in the rubble. As these CH-901As moving into the area would be doing just that, hitting targets fighting in the wooded areas, such as these American troops in this wooded terrain here, would be hitting them, firing down at the armor, with the armor firing frag T shells up at them from two different sides, as well as the turret machine gunners opening fire with the Coax machine gun fire, and artillery precision strikes that were fired at a safe enough distance from the facility itself to not risk destroying or damaging it, eliminating these troops, as well as the artillery that opened fire imminently after the showing of this map, with this artillery striking at the opening of the map, as well as up here, that destroyed much of this company's vehicles that were out here, minus the two that were destroyed a bit later when the artillery shell came in here and decimated these two remaining LMTV trucks that were part of the company, the headquarters company of the battalion, guarding the facility proper itself. Whereas this battalion had moved in from its campsite, its headquarters platoon establishing a star formation around its lighter vehicles of the Combat Engineer Company, or Alpha Company, or ACO, and this platoon moving into position establishing security in the parking lot of the grocery store until the grocery store was destroyed by shelling that consisted of a terrain denial strike that channeled these forces into this area to be brutally shelled. As a result, when these shells came in, along with shelling hitting here, as the comprising artillery batteries of the artillery battalion of the 93rd had a wide array of different fire mission options to assist in the battle breaking out here, as they had 40 Howitzers now devoted completely to this battle, and could conduct terrain denial and precision strike hits all at the same time with their different batteries firing. With loitering munitions destroying the two last vehicles of this platoon of the Military Intelligence Company, with artillery destroying these vehicles and a few from this platoon that were caught in the strikes that destroyed the headquarters vehicles, these forces of these two platoons of mechanized infantry, after this platoon had dismounted its troops, had moved around and temporarily had stopped where these tanks stopped before being allowed to proceed first, as they would go around and outflank these forces of combat engineers here that had already lost 3 of their Bradleys right off the bat to HJ-10 anti-tank missiles fired from AFT-10s, and all of the anti-tank company that was firing from a distance, and tank shells in the form of the 125mm tank shells fired from the main guns of the leading tanks. Once they passed the area, they dismounted their squads of troops, with the other platoon moving up even further, dismounting 4 squads by the time they reached the end point right here. They dismounted 4 squads, with the last squad dismounting from the VN-20 as the vehicles fanned out here, moving up a little bit further. And they began to take fire from the armored engineering vehicle that had withdrawn from the area once these vehicles had been smashed. As so many things are occurring at around the same time. it's being attempted to convey them in as rational of an order as possible. With these squads leaving this platoon worth of vehicles now curling around the street, the VN-20 at the head of them and the 4 Type 89A armor personnel carriers behind the VN-20 leading them of that platoon with the Type 89As, the squads were dismounted from the VN-20 and Type 89As to begin to clear these buildings, with one squad going into this building, one into this building here, before they rendezvoused with this other squad clearing this building in this gutted motel that fired out of this building at these American forces that ended up destroying the lead tank with 2 javelins fired at the same time at the lead tank, which completely overpowered and destroyed the lead tank. I mean, the lead tank of the first platoon on this side of the 4 combat platoons moving from under this overpass of the highway, with the other 4 tanks continuing to move into this particular area while the other 2 platoons had gone around here, followed by the other platoon behind them, moving gradually now into this area after having lost their lead tank, with 3 tanks pulling security around the damaged tank for recovery assets from the headquarters platoon of this company to move in and recover the destroyed tank. As heavy fire was being exchanged between the tanks and these troops now firing AT-4s, as they did not have all the javelins, all 10 javelins, they only had 2 of the company as they were dispersed. They were now being overpowered by the combo of these squads firing out of this building and the tank fire, as early on their other dismounted squad in this double column rolling shield had been destroyed by the incoming HJ-10s and tank shells, frag T shells, flying in on to the back rear of this Bradley, with other heat shells hitting these Bradleys with the HJ-10 missiles coming in and hitting them. As these squads, another squad moving into this area, hugging up against this rubble while 2 were in this building, now had moved one squad into this area right here to assault the squad of combat engineers from this rubbled building. They were firing down at them with the tanks already wiping them out. The other 2 squads moved into this building, with one squad moving in here and another squad moving around to the corner of this building, before all 3 peeled around this rubble and began to engage the Bradley that had been in this area but began, due to taking some fire from the lead tank, began to move into this area and was engaged and destroyed by the fire from the tanks and VN-20. They didn't get very far as they began to move again. They were completely destroyed by the crossfire of the tanks and VN-20, and even an HJ-10 came in and hit it as well. As happened to the engineer vehicle, the M1150 that pulled out of the area and then wrapped back around to help them lead their local attack. They too had been gotten a bead on by the ISR assets and directed a HJ-10 right into them, along with tank shells and fire from the armored personnel carriers, heavy machine gun turret gunners operating their W-85s 12.7mm machine guns, and the 100mm and 30mm cannons, the 100mm main gun and the 30mm autocannon, shredding into them as well and destroying the armored engineering vehicle, while their dismounted squad had been eliminated by the dismounted mechanized infantry and tank fire. While this squad was busy being ferreted out, as this squad broke into 2 and crossed the street, engaging them and the troops over here to help their other 2 squads that were at the time pinned down before they moved into this area. While this squad had already crossed into the rubble, this squad was fighting over the rubble, and that's how they ended up losing a soldier. And this squad lost a soldier doing the same thing, as they were being fired at by troops in this rubble pile and this rubble pile, having to divert attention against both. While early on, as this Bradley moved in and dismounted their half squad from up here, as this half squad went in this vehicle and the other half squad went in this Bradley that this squad actually belonged to, moving them into battle to support their own squad and also drop off the half squad, they were hit by an HJ-10 anti-tank missile and tank shell fire and destroyed by a heat shell HJ-10 anti-tank missile as well. And They did manage to dismount their squad, but gradually they were wiped out by the full force of this full remaining attacking squad that had lost a soldier, and this squad that also lost a soldier, but they overpowered, these two squads overpowered this 1.5 squads. And before they held this rubble pile, they began to fire at these forces that had now moved out of the way, as these forces by then finished clearing this building and fired down at these vehicles that were temporarily actually safe behind this 5-floor building from HJ-10s due to the fact the HJ-10s would hit the building and not these vehicles from the angle they were firing from. Now moving out in these double column rolling shields on each side of these vehicles, they were hit by HJ-10s and tank shells and destroyed, while other HJ-10s impacted and destroyed, ripped apart this headquarters platoon. As all of that was going on, Bradley lost, and these forces moving in here and here being destroyed from this platoon, while this platoon was destroyed right off the bat, with the vehicle lost right off the bat from this platoon due to it being exposed around the corner from HJ-10 fire. These forces had wrapped up clearing here, caused them to flee by firing out the window and get hit, driving them out into the open, along with this out in the open headquarters element being hit really quickly, really early on. The finishing off of this platoon ensured, with the terrain denial strikes keeping them all penned into this area, with the fire coming from the dismounted squads, the vehicles, and the tanks moving in the area, as well as these vehicle platoons here outflanking these forces and dropping off their squads, including the 4 that went in to clear these buildings and take the facility, leaving 1 from the VN-20 to dismount beside their vehicle when this exchange was going on. These forces of the Bravo Company, the military intelligence, already having been since destroyed by the CH-901A fire, tank shells from this company, HJ-10 fire, and artillery fire, along with the armed reactionary civilians, with only a few making it into the building before the artillery strikes even happened. 7 made it into the building, into this building, were now being cleared by the 4 squads of the platoon that dismounted 1 squad with the vehicles and the other 4 into this building. They were being methodically cleared as the squads went through the halls of this building and into this building to engage these forces. These forces had, by this point, been completely annihilated by artillery fire, as well as CH-901A fire and tank fire, with 2 squads of the 4 leaving this building, running up the hill to the sediment pools and chemical treatment area, breaking into this building here, linking up by then with the squads that went out into this area, sending 1 into this building to aid them, these 2, with 1 squad peeling off and going around to support these squads to get any retreating personnel by catching them from outside in this tiny clump of trees right here where they took position, before the 2 squads that originally cleared this building, before the other third one went in, moving around and up this even higher hilly terrain above the hill that the whole facility was built on, before these 2 last squads cleared this building, with 1 squad taking security position along this large pool, man-made pool where the water was pumped out of and treated and then pumped back into the water system of the city, which it was stagnant, of course, as again, everything was down. There was no grid or working anything due to the grid being hackable as it was connected to the internet. So these forces came out to clear and hold the outside part of this hill and secured this area behind the building as the other squads secured this area. But by then, all these guys had been KIA'd, with these tanks moving up early on, having taken fire as they moved up, but they returned fire and helped eliminate these troops with the adding on of the CH-901As and the strafing that occurred up here as these fighters swooped down here, strafing these armed reactionary civilians and Bravo Company in support of their other troops that were moving into this area at the same time after these shells had landed. So the combo of the shells landing, the strafing attacks, and a few CH-901As hitting these vehicles before the shells even really landed had finished off the forces in the north, while other shells finished off the rest of the headquarters troops that were outside in the south of the building, and tank fire and other CH-901As, while the strafing and artillery and other CH-901As got these guys early on, as these forces were about here before they moved up even further and split up and finished off the rest of this half platoon with this vehicle here, essentially. So all of these different occurrences with the building being cleared, forcing these guys out, were this was happening after the headquarters platoon had been destroyed by HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, as the terrain denial strikes prevented them from fleeing, while the mechanized infantry was surrounding this entire area from further off out of the map, with the rest of the tank battalion surrounding the area further off the map as well, with the two tank companies committed, the anti-tank company firing in support of them, hitting these vehicles, and then these later, last, as this was the last group of vehicles to be destroyed of the combat engineer company, while this action was going on where they were clearing this building. That's essentially the rough timetable, with this rubble pile and this rubble pile having been completely cleared by the dismounted troops of this platoon while these troops were fleeing. As there's so many different things happening at different times, and at the same time as well for some actions, conveying them in order is difficult, but essentially that was the rough order of events, as all of them were occurring in different parts of this relatively small battle space, being, again, 1 kilometer by 1 full mile in terms of its scope, with other forces off map surrounding the larger area of the Armored Battalion and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that this company came from. Of the 3 total companies of maneuver forces that were committed into this battle, that were being supported by the anti-tank company and the artillery battalion, of course, of the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade, and the pair of J-11 fighters and the headquarters battalion having fired their drones, or CH-901A loitering munitions, which were on AI target mode, set to the parameters based upon the warhead types, as these were equipped with HE warheads and not the heat warheads, which would have been far better because they would have destroyed the Bradleys and the engineering vehicles. Although these could damage them, they were best used against clusters of dismounts and against lighter armor like the MRAPs, like the Max Pro MRAPs. And they did a devastating number on the armed civilians. The MRAPs that were also hit at about the same time by not just CH-901As, but artillery strikes and the strafing attacks, as these markers, again, indicate imminent strikes, and the rest of the strikes served as terrain denial to also mask the movements of their forces even further off the map that were surrounding this larger area, while this company of mechanized infantry, combat elements of it, and this company of tanks and this company of tanks were capturing the area itself to seize control of the plant, taking it relatively intact and succeeding, while also completely destroying the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion. As they had concluded their operation in this area, destroying the American Battalion of Special Troops, the 545th, with their mechanized infantry and armored forces, the next battle that was to rage was the surrounding and clearance of the OG&E plant, which itself by now, as this battle was only a 30-minute long fight, this had already been surrounded, and now forces were closing in to take the plant itself, as early on artillery fire had spurred civilians to retreat into this area where the Frontier OG&E plant was, the Frontier plant, as the maneuver elements committed to capturing the plant were now beginning to make their moves, as this battle was still raging as well, and would come to its end at the same time at this junction of I-40 and 44, as the fighting over the power plant was about to come to its end. As also At 4:30, this battle was going on at the same time as the capture of this plant was occurring, and this battle was wrapping up as this was occurring, with the fighting raging in the whole of the downtown two pockets at the same time, as even this fighting was still going on here against the remains of the 2nd of the 134th. This fighting, again, ending at 6 a.m. or thereabouts, minutes before. Ample activities still dragging on within the Battle of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, during the invasion of the United States in the South Central invasion sector.